The British Empire waging war on America's free speech, a historical pattern of censorship. In a disturbing echo of its imperial past, the United Kingdom has once again positioned itself as an adversary to the fundamental right of free speech, this time targeting American citizens. Recently, the UK government issued a warning on X, formerly Twitter, urging people to think before you post, in connection with a post from the Crown Prosecution Service about inciting hatred and online violence. While at first glance this may seem like harmless advice, it reveals a deeper, more troubling trend: the UK's propensity for censorship and control over public discourse, which has been a hallmark of its historical governance, particularly during the height of the British Empire. Censorship, a tool of British imperialism. The British Empire has a long and infamous history of using censorship as a means to suppress dissent and maintain control over its vast territories. This approach to governance, far from spreading democracy and freedom as some might claim, was primarily motivated by a desire to maintain power and stifle any opposition. One need only look to British rule in India to see the extent of this censorship. During the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British passed the Gagging Act, which tightly regulated printing presses and the tone of published material. This was followed by the Vernacular Press Act of 1878, which sought to control any writing considered seditious and specifically targeted publications in languages other than English. This act was a direct attack on the voices of the Indian people, attempting to silence any criticism of British rule. The Press Act of 1910 further tightened the noose around free expression, forcing publications to deposit large financial securities with the government, funds that could be seized if anything critical of the British Empire, its army, or ruling class was published. This act was aimed at crushing the rising tide of Indian nationalism and ensuring that only pro-British narratives were allowed to reach the public. During World War II, as Indian nationalist sentiment grew stronger, the British response was to clamp down even harder on the press. The Quit India campaign, a pivotal moment in the struggle for Indian independence, saw press freedom curtailed to an extreme degree, with any coverage of political parties being forbidden. Censorship was not just a tool of control, but an instrument of white supremacy, used to maintain the colonial power structure at the expense of the colonized populations. This pattern of censorship continued well into the late 20th century, even as the British Empire began to crumble. In 1978, the far-right government of Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, under Ian Smith, passed a law that prohibited journalists from reporting anything that deviated from the official version of events in the ongoing civil war. This law also limited acceptable sources for reporters to government statements, discussions in the White Parliament, or material approved by the White Rhodesian Military Command. Smith's government, which saw itself as upholding British values in Africa, used censorship as a means to perpetuate white minority rule in a rapidly decolonizing continent. The present threat to American free speech. Fast forward to today, and the UK's recent warning to think before you post is a chilling reminder of this imperial legacy. While the British government claims to be acting in the name of preventing violence and hatred, the vagueness of their statements and the ominous threat of prosecution cast a long shadow over the right to free expression. This approach is not just problematic for British citizens, it also poses a direct threat to Americans who cherish their First Amendment rights. The United States was founded on the principles of free speech and individual liberty, values that have been enshrined in the Constitution and defended at great cost. Americans have fought and died to protect these freedoms, and any attempt by a foreign government to undermine them must be met with staunch resistance. The exhortation to think before you post may seem like innocuous advice, but it is laden with the potential to chill free speech. The Crown Prosecution Service's warning about inciting hatred and online violence is so broadly defined that it could easily be used to target any expression of dissent or criticism. This is not the first time that the UK has attempted to silence voices it finds inconvenient, and it is unlikely to be the last. Defending American freedoms against foreign encroachment. Given the UK's historical and ongoing tendencies towards censorship, Americans must be vigilant in defending their First Amendment rights. The British government's warning should be seen for what it is: an attempt to extend its control over the digital public square, a space that should remain free and open. The idea that the British Empire was motivated by a desire to spread democracy and freedom is a myth that has been debunked by history. From the Gagging Act in India to the Rhodesian censorship laws, the British have repeatedly used censorship to maintain their power and suppress dissent. Today's attempts to regulate speech online are just the latest iteration of this long-standing practice. Americans must not allow the UK or any other foreign power to infringe upon the freedoms that are the bedrock of our society. We must resist any and all efforts to impose censorship on our speech, whether they come from abroad or from within our own borders. The right to free expression is non-negotiable, and we must be prepared to defend it against all threats, both old and new. In conclusion, the British Empire's legacy of censorship is alive and well in the actions of its modern government. The warning to think before you post is not just advice. It is a veiled threat against the free speech rights of Americans. We must remain vigilant and resolute in our defense of the First Amendment, ensuring that the freedoms for which so many have fought and died are not eroded by foreign interference.